On November 23, 2006, a chillingly calm 911 call turned a suburban home into a crime scene. Paramedics and police arrived to find 28-year-old English teacher Ashley Scott battered beyond recognition, her once bright future snuffed out by a brutal assault. As whispers of infidelity, manipulation, and years of hidden violence surface, one question hangs over every twisted detail. How did a college sweetheart romance spiral into this night of horror, and who will ever be held accountable? This is the murder of Ashley Scott. Thanksgiving is typically a time for families to come together, multiple generations united around the dinner table in the home of the family elders. It's a moment to reflect, to share gratitude for the past year, and to show love and appreciation for one another. This is the tradition in many households, but not everyone follows these customs. In some families, love and unity are replaced with tension, resentment, and even violence. Holidays carry no special weight, and the lines of acceptable behavior have long been crossed. This story sheds light on a chilling tragedy that unfolded within one such family. It all began on November 23, 2006, at exactly 3:46 p.m., when a disturbing call was made to emergency services in Memphis, Tennessee. Emergencies don't take breaks for holidays, and so 911 dispatchers are always prepared for the unexpected. But even with that understanding, the operator who answered the call that afternoon was left deeply unsettled, a reaction he later shared with a colleague. What unnerved him wasn't just the nature of the situation, but the eerie composure of the caller. It was as if the man on the line was casually ordering food, not reporting a life-threatening emergency. He identified himself as Jeffrey Scott and claimed his wife had been unconscious since 11 a.m. In the background, another voice interjected, coldly stating she was likely already dead. When the dispatcher pressed for more details, Scott replied flatly, "She was breathing a moment ago. Now she's dead." His tone never changed. Recognizing the potential severity of the situation, authorities immediately dispatched a specialized unit to the scene. Within minutes, officers arrived at the residence, where Jeffrey greeted them and directed them to the bedroom, where his wife, Ashley Scott, lay motionless. When officers stepped into the bedroom, they found a man leaning over Ashley Scott, performing CPR. He introduced himself as Dr. Robert McGee. Longtime friend of Jeffrey's, McGee told responders that Ashley was still clinging to life, but only barely. Her pulse was faint, and her blood pressure was critically low. Paramedics quickly assessed her condition and confirmed his evaluation. They suspected she had suffered a severe head injury, likely from a blow with a blunt object. Her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light. Blood was seeping from both her nose and mouth. The rest of her body revealed the extent of her suffering. Bruises and abrasions covered her legs, chest, and back. The medical team moved swiftly, initiating emergency resuscitation efforts in a desperate attempt to save her. They did everything they could. Intubation, defibrillation, powerful drugs to stimulate her heart. But nothing worked. Ashley Scott was slipping away, and despite their best efforts, the medical team could only watch as her condition worsened. She was rushed to the hospital, where a neurosurgeon was brought in to evaluate her upon arrival. His findings echoed the fears of the paramedics. At just 28 years old, Ashley was in the final stages of brain death. Her vital organs were shutting down one by one, and there was no chance of recovery. In the face of such irreversible damage, doctors made the heartbreaking decision to end life support. Not long after, Ashley Scott was pronounced dead. There was no mistaking the brutality Ashley Scott had endured. Her right ear was discolored, an unnatural green, commonly seen in boxers who take repeated hits to the same area. A clear imprint of a man's shoe was stamped into her back, suggesting she had been stomped on or worse, jumped on. Her frail body was littered with bruises in various stages of healing, a haunting indication that this wasn't a one-time act of violence, but something that had been happening over time. As doctors scrambled to save her, investigators began questioning both Jeffrey Scott and Dr. Robert McGee. The doctor quickly explained that he had been the one to push for calling 911, and described what had led him there. Around 2:30 p.m., he received a call from Jeffrey, an old college friend with whom he kept occasional contact. Jeffrey told him that he and Ashley had been drinking the night before, and afterward she became ill. According to Jeffrey, Ashley had gone to bed the night before and simply never woke up. It was only then, he claimed, that he decided to call for help. Although Dr. McGee was busy at the time, he put his responsibilities on hold and headed to the couple's home. When he arrived, he found Jeffrey sitting beside Ashley, who showed no signs of life. Right away, McGee sensed that something wasn't being said. He suspected the couple had argued and that something serious had happened, something they initially hoped to conceal, that he believed was the real reason they reached out to him. Instead of calling 911 right away, he was aware the Scotts had been going through a rough patch. Ashley had turned to alcohol, and Jeffrey had a reputation for losing his temper and hitting her. But once McGee examined Ashley, he realized the situation was far worse than anything he'd imagined. There was no hope left. Ashley needed urgent medical intervention and fast. Realizing the gravity of her condition, Dr. McGee insisted that Jeffrey call 911 immediately. As events unfolded, Robert began to piece together the bigger picture. It was clear that something far more serious had occurred, perhaps even a calculated act of violence. He later admitted to authorities that he intentionally kept Jeffrey at the scene, suspecting that the man might try to escape. Meanwhile, Jeffrey showed no emotion, not fear, not guilt, nothing. He seemed completely indifferent to the fate of the woman he once claimed to love. When officers questioned him about what had happened, Jeffrey recounted a dispute the night before. He said he had discovered messages Ashley had exchanged with another man and believed she was having an affair. Jeffrey claimed that, overwhelmed by the betrayal, he struck Ashley, but insisted it happened only once. According to him, she was heavily intoxicated, stumbled and fell. He portrayed her as a habitual drinker prone to erratic behavior and said he was tired of dealing with her outbursts. That night, he kicked her out of the house as he claimed to have done before and said she spent the night in the garage. The next morning, he found her still lying there, apparently asleep. Moved by pity, he said he carried her back inside and placed her on the bed. But as the hours passed and she didn't wake up, he realized something was wrong. Only then, he claimed, did he try to revive her and eventually call his doctor friend to come over. Nevertheless, the police dismissed his account. Upon their arrival, the woman was found covered in bruises from head to toe. Her face and head severely battered and she was bleeding. Even if she had been intoxicated and fallen, it wouldn't have resulted in such extensive injuries. It was evident she had been assaulted. Scott was taken into custody and initially charged with aggravated assault. However, once the autopsy results were obtained, the charge was escalated to first-degree murder. The pathologist's report was grim, revealing that Ashley Scott's cause of death was a subdural hematoma on the right side of her brain. Such injuries result from a violent blow to the head, causing the brain to collide with the skull, leading to significant bleeding and swelling, which in turn restricts flow of oxygen. This triggers the failure of vital organs and systems in her body. It's an agonizing process. What makes it even more heartbreaking is that she could have survived if help had been administered promptly, ideally within the first few hours. Moreover, over 50 hematomas were discovered on her body, each varying in color and intensity, which corroborated the statements from medical personnel that she had been subjected to repeated assaults. The extent of Ashley's suffering was unimaginable. The most chilling part of it all was that the person responsible for her pain was someone who was supposed to protect her. After Jeffrey's arrest, detectives started investigating the crime scene. Evidence of a struggle was evident throughout the house, with items scattered everywhere and furniture upturned. A shattered vase was found in the living room. On the kitchen table, near a laptop, were printed messages between Ashley and her lover, which aligned with the suspect's claims about the motive behind the crime. Upon further inspection of the garage, officers discovered bloodstains on the floor. Inside Mrs. Scott's car, they found women's clothing, personal belongings, including a handbag with her documents and passport. It seemed the victim had been planning to flee, but never had the chance. The officers then decided to interview the family's relatives and friends, uncovering surprising details about their lives and circumstances, which provided more insight into the incident. Sadly, women sometimes fall in love with the wrong men and become entangled in relationships that start off full of promise. However, over time, the person they care for transforms into an oppressive tyrant, turning their lives into a living nightmare. Victims of both emotional and physical abuse often lose touch with reality and may even rationalize the abuser's behavior. In these situations, outside psychological support is crucial, as the victim is frequently unable to help themselves or break free. Ashley Scott, born Nate Pittman on November 4, 1978 in Bossier City, Louisiana, faced a difficult start. Her parents separated before she was born, but destiny eventually favored her mother, Donna, who met and married Jimmy Pittman. Jimmy adopted Ashley and loved her unconditionally from the moment she was born. Notably, Jimmy already had a 5-year-old daughter named Kika from a previous relationship. Sadly, Jimmy and Donna's marriage didn't last, and they divorced a few years later. It's important to mention that Donna was the one who left the family and eventually remarried. Ashley decided to stay with her father, though she continued to maintain a relationship with her mother. Despite the divorce, Ashley had a happy childhood, growing up to be kind and well-behaved. Those around her saw her as a true beauty and predicted a promising future for her. In 1996, she graduated from high school and went on to attend Watchett of Baptist University in Arkansas. It was there that she met her first love. Jeffrey Scott, who also attended the same school, happened to enroll at the university and their paths crossed. Jeffrey, captivated by her radiant smile, soon struck up a relationship with her. The young couple appeared perfect, always seen together and holding hands. Ashley's friends admired her, thinking she had found a dependable partner. Ashley played into their curiosity by sharing how sweet and kind he was, and how fortunate she felt to have him. In February, Pittman earned her long-awaited degree in education, bringing her childhood dream closer to reality. She had always wanted to become a teacher and dedicate her life to children. Then, on June 9, 2001, Ashley and Jeffrey tied the knot. However, things did not unfold as she had imagined in her youthful dreams. Unexpectedly, a darker side of her chosen partner began to emerge. While others were taken aback, the bride had been aware of it all along, but had chosen to overlook it. A year before the wedding, Ashley sent a letter to her sister, Kika, explaining that she could no longer maintain contact with them and asked them to respect her decision. As a result, her family was not invited to the wedding either. Friends of Ashley, who were fortunate enough to attend the ceremony, were taken aback. The overwhelming majority of the guests were from the groom's side, despite Ashley having a large, close-knit family. This struck them as unusual. However, they later understood why. The reason was that her family did not approve of Jeffrey, and he made no attempt to change their opinion. Behind the facade of a seemingly nice guy, something darker lurked. He often spoke disparagingly about her family and behaved inappropriately toward them, feeling completely justified in doing so. What was most shocking, however, was Ashley's reaction. It was as if she was making excuses for his behavior. During the wedding, Jeffrey insulted some of her friends once again and acted arrogantly. After the newlyweds relocated to Cordova, a suburb of Memphis, Tennessee, Ashley's relationships with many people began to deteriorate. Those who didn't completely cut ties still kept in touch, but maintained their distance. After the Jeffrey began working as a computer systems technician at his father's company, while Ashley, now Mrs. Scott, took a job as an English teacher at a middle school. She was well liked by everyone. Ashley was seen as beautiful, cheerful, intelligent, and sociable. She loved her work and had a strong bond with her students. Later, Paul Dooley described Ashley as a skilled professional and talented educator. He shared that she was the main reason he looked forward to teaching English each day. In court, he confessed that the school was the only place where she truly felt safe and appreciated, a refuge where Jeffrey Scott couldn't reach her. Over time, however, the relationship between the couple continued to deteriorate. Ashley's bond with her family nearly disintegrated. She refused to discuss it and referred to the situation as her personal choice. Undoubtedly, these decisions were influenced by a master manipulator, her husband. In the early years of their marriage, Jeffrey exerted complete control over her, isolating her from any external support. Constant criticism over the smallest of things gradually eroded Ashley's self-esteem. Scott did everything he could to suppress her. During this time, she communicated with only a handful of people, one of whom was her childhood friend, Lori. The two had been friends since 5th grade and stayed in touch into adulthood. In September 2006, a high school reunion was planned for Ashley's alma mater. She was excited to attend, and despite her husband's reluctance, she decided to go. While those at the reunion didn't notice any major changes in her, Lori couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Throughout the evening, Jeffrey called Ashley repeatedly, preventing her from relaxing or enjoying herself. He interrogated her about who she was speaking with, what she was wearing, what she was eating and drinking, and what she was discussing, essentially trying to control every aspect of her life. During this time, Ashley confided in Lori about the nightmare she was living, revealing that she couldn't continue like this. She admitted that she was considering divorce, and had even reached out to a divorce attorney. She also confessed that she was aware of her husband's ongoing infidelities. For example, she mentioned an affair with a colleague named Blair Brown, someone she had once gotten along with. However, she explained that over time, she had forgiven Blair. Blair had contacted her to reveal Jeffrey's true nature and the danger he posed. It's important to note that this party marked the last night of Ashley's life. After that, Ashley stopped communicating with anyone for several weeks, and new bruises began to appear on her body. Detectives took an interest in the accounts shared by Ashley's relatives and friends, gathering valuable information through their conversations. Lori revealed that, shortly before Ashley's death, Jeffrey had called her multiple times to complain about his wife. He claimed that Ashley drank excessively, lost her balance, and often fell, which he used to explain the bruises on her body. However, the following morning, Ashley would have no memory of these events and would blame him instead. Jeffrey accused their mutual acquaintance, Blair, of corrupting Ashley, claiming she had turned her against him and fostered her growing alcohol dependency. He also expressed that he no longer wanted children because he felt disgusted by his wife after everything that had happened. Jeffrey accused Ashley of being unfaithful, lying, and struggling with alcoholism. Despite his claims, didn't believe him and felt he was only trying to cover for himself. Eventually, Lori realized that Ashley had become a victim of domestic violence and was in serious trouble. After each of Jeffrey's calls, Lori would try to reach Ashley, but her friend never answered, which was unusual. The last time they saw each other was just before the tragic events. The two went shopping, but Ashley didn't buy anything for herself. She seemed sad and deep in thought. Lori attempted to talk to her about her marriage, but Ashley didn't want to discuss it, insisting she didn't want to ruin the evening. She briefly mentioned that she was considering divorce, but was terrified of taking that step. Ashley knew Jeffrey well and was afraid his reaction would be completely unpredictable. Shortly after, Blair Brown, whose name had come up frequently in conversations about the Scott family, was brought in for questioning. Blair admitted that she had indeed been Jeffrey's lover in the past. Blair, having experienced Jeffrey's uncontrollable fits of rage firsthand, knew all too well how dangerous he could be. It was established that her friendship with Ashley had been rekindled about 6 months before the crime. Blair felt sympathy for her and offered occasional support. She also confessed that her relationship with Jeffrey had been a mistake and apologized multiple times for it. The two women occasionally met up for drinks. Ashley would often seek refuge at Blair's place to escape Jeffrey. One day, however, Jeffrey tracked her down and came for her. In that moment, Blair witnessed a brutal attack. Jeffrey struck Ashley multiple times in the face before throwing her out onto the street, completely indifferent to the fact that Blair was a witness. Even after this incident, Ashley continued to downplay her husband's guilt, making excuses for his actions. During another interrogation, Scott admitted that he had only contacted Robert McGee 12 to 15 hours after the argument. During that time, his wife was unconscious and alone in the garage. Jeffrey continued to insist that he had only struck her once in response to discovering her infidelity. Afterward, he sent her to the garage, threw bedding on the floor, and left her there. The bleeding woman was left to spend her final hours freezing and in pain while her husband rested comfortably in the house. However, the autopsy results contradicted his claims. It was evident that Jeffrey had consistently mistreated his wife. Further investigations revealed that Jeffrey occasionally hired escorts, even while Ashley was at the reunion. Despite this, he continued to blame her for all their problems. In fact, shortly before she decided to file for divorce, Ashley had met a young man named Michael Lowe. Ashley and Michael exchanged messages from October 29th to November 22nd, 2006. He was the one who encouraged her to leave her husband, assuring her that he would support her and had everything prepared for her departure. Michael told her that he loved her and wanted to offer her a different life. When Jeffrey discovered their messages, he became furious and decided to teach his unfaithful wife a lesson. The trial of Jeffrey Scott began on January 13, 2009. The prosecution argued that the crime was premeditated. It was clear that the argument between the couple had started in the living room, where a broken vase was found. The violence then escalated as they moved through the house, with Ashley suffering abuse in nearly every room. Blood stains were found in almost every room. The divorce attorney Ashley had consulted testified on behalf of the prosecution. The divorce attorney explained that she had met with Ashley the day before her death. At that time, all the divorce documents were prepared, and Ashley simply needed to pack her things and leave while Jeffrey was at work. Rachel advised Ashley to leave secretly, which explained the items and documents found in her car. However, Ashley did not follow the expert's advice. She wanted to confront her husband before leaving, a decision that turned out to be fatal. The attorney did everything she could to help Ashley, even offering her services for a symbolic fee. She also mentioned that she knew her client had been drinking, which had led her to quit her beloved job. Ashley had used alcohol to numb the emotional pain she felt in her marriage and needed support. For a long time, the women communicated in secret to ensure that Ashley's departure would be as safe as possible. Since her husband controlled all of her calls, they arranged to meet on neutral ground or used payphones to communicate. Many witnesses confirmed seeing scratches or bruises on Ashley, which she carefully covered with layers of makeup. Some people knew the real cause of her injuries, but felt powerless to intervene. In their final report, the medical examiners noted that Ashley had been frequently kicked. It appeared that Jeffrey would knock her to the ground and then stomp on her. Old bruises, consistent with shoe marks, were found on her back and legs. The defense team for the accused worked relentlessly to reduce the charge to second-degree murder. They attempted to paint the victim in an unflattering light, portraying her as an alcoholic and an unstable hysteric. In short, the defense did everything they could to make the jury believe that Scott also suffered in the marriage. They discredited the victim, couldn't defend herself because she was no longer alive. It was revealed that in February 2005, Ashley had been fined for drunk driving. Meanwhile, Jeffrey claimed he wanted to repair the marriage, bought a new home, and was open to having children, all for a woman who had a lover and exchanged intimate photos with him. Regarding the crime itself, he claimed he lost control, realizing his efforts were in vain, that Ashley had found someone else. "I regret the pain I caused you," he addressed his wife's family, "but I mourn her loss and pray for her soul." In contrast, during the trial, it was noted that after his arrest, Scott didn't ask about his wife's condition. Instead, he inquired about the outcome of a recent football game. His attorney resorted to underhanded tactics. During his statement, he even suggested that the victim sustained most of her injuries during a seizure caused by alcohol withdrawal. An independent expert was found to support this claim. To counter this, the assistant county medical examiner was called to testify. He read the autopsy results, listed all the injuries on the body, and most importantly, confirmed that the cause of death could not have been the result of accidental falls. The prosecutor argued that the defense's claim of an unintentional crime was absurd. It was evident that the victim had tried to escape her tormentor, but out of a lingering affection for her husband, hoped to end things on amicable terms. Meanwhile, the accused showed her the printout of her messages with Michael, then attacked her. as he repeatedly struck her. He knew he was inflicting excruciating pain and suffering. He then finished her off in the garage, where she lost consciousness. Scott saw the severity of her injuries, but chose to ignore them and failed to seek medical help. Instead, he waited and only then called a doctor. The prosecutor argued that the accused wanted his wife dead. However, an unexpected piece of evidence surfaced. Investigators discovered that Ashley had been trying to save the marriage. It was revealed that she had been taking special medication to get pregnant and had supported the purchase of a new home. Perhaps she had become so dependent on the toxic relationship that she couldn't imagine life without Jeffrey. Yet, she eventually decided to leave. It's possible that she didn't want to leave secretly, hoping that her husband would change and that everything would work out. The victims of abuse often hold on to such illusory hopes, clinging to the belief that things could improve. On January 19, 2009, Jeffrey Scott was found guilty of second-degree murder. Even the judge expressed dissatisfaction with the jury's verdict, criticizing them because the vote in favor of the original charge was 12-1. One juror did not believe the accused was guilty enough for first-degree murder. According to state law, a unanimous decision is required to convict someone of first-degree murder. This left the victim's family deeply disheartened. The accused will serve 25 years behind bars without the possibility of parole. However, many feel this punishment is insufficient for someone who tormented a woman for years. He isolated her from everyone, manipulated her, and made her believe that neither she nor her family was worthy of being part of his life. Ashley's father, in particular, was heartbroken, stating, "M revealed the deep pain and heartbreak that come from losing a loved one under such tragic circumstances. His grief highlights how difficult it is to accept the loss of a child in such a brutal way, knowing who was responsible." She was the kind of teacher every parent hopes their child will have, joyful, dedicated, and deeply beloved by her students. Fiona Beale seemed to live a quiet, ordinary life in Northampton, England, with her long-term partner, Nick Billingham. But behind her warm classroom smile was a mind unraveling in the shadows. What started as a seemingly hiding it in plain sight for months. This is the case of Fiona Beale and Nick Billingham. The woman seen dancing cheerfully in front of her students is 47-year-old Fiona Beale, a primary school teacher at Eastfield Academy in Northampton. She was cherished by her students and respected for her passion and commitment to making every lesson count. But what no one could have foreseen is that within a matter of months, Fiona would become a name splashed across national headlines for reasons no one could have imagined. In this story, we'll explore a series of disturbing events that unfolded in England in 2021. While little is known about Fiona's early years, those who knew her painted a picture of a warm, friendly woman who adored teaching and was genuinely valued by her pupils. Fiona shared her home in Northampton, located about 60 miles northwest of London, with her partner, 42-year-old Nick Billingham. The town, among England's largest, had nearly 250,000 residents as of the February 2021 census. The couple lived on Moore Street, a peaceful neighborhood that would soon become the center of a horrifying revelation. Fiona and Nick had been together for 17 years, weathering their share of highs and lows like many long-term couples. Though the full picture of their relationship is still unclear, especially since the case concluded only recently, fragments of their story have begun to surface. Leslie, someone who knew both Fiona and Nick, offered her perspective on their relationship. "I thought she was really nice," Leslie recalled. "While they weren't the type to show much affection in public, they appeared content together." Leslie remembered Fiona as polite and talkative when Nick brought her over for tea. However, she described Nick as something of a ladies' man, someone who thrived on female attention, which made the longevity of his relationships uncertain. Everything between them seemed to unravel quickly in November 2021, just as both Fiona and Nick reportedly tested positive for a widespread virus. On November 1st, Fiona told her family that she and Nick were self-isolating at home for the mandatory 10 days. But by the very next day, she sent a text to her sister that took everyone by surprise. Nick had broken up with her and supposedly left to be with another woman. In the days that followed, Nick continued to send messages to friends and family, creating the impression that life had simply moved on. Nick sent a message to his mother, claiming he had left with a woman named Faye and was enjoying a fresh start. During this time, Fiona remained at home, completing the 10-day isolation period as required due to their reported illness. Once her isolation ended, she returned to work, where colleagues offered sympathy and encouragement following the breakup. But the emotional fallout was more severe than many realized. The end of her long-term relationship with Nick left Fiona visibly shaken, and the strain on her mental health became increasingly apparent. By late February 2022, almost 4 months after their supposed separation, her psychological state had begun to deteriorate significantly. Struggling with the memories embedded in the home they once shared, Fiona decided to move far away to Cumbria, putting distance both physical and emotional between herself and her past. Then, on March 15, 2022, she sent a series of troubling messages to her family, alarming them enough to contact the authorities. Police responded to a welfare check at a lodge she had rented in the Lake District. There, they discovered Fiona gravely injured in a bathtub. Constable Josh Parkin later described the disturbing scene in court, recalling how eerie, unsettling music played from her phone. At first glance, he thought she might already be dead. "I saw a woman lying naked in the bathtub," Parkin testified. The water around her was clouded with bodily fluids, making him believe she had already died. Nearby, a phone was playing soft acoustic music, its tone eerily sinister. Parkin immediately called for an ambulance and recommended they lift her from the tub to begin CPR. In an attempt to get a response, he tugged at her ear, and to his relief, Fiona stirred. She let out a faint moan, shifted slightly, and gradually began to display emotion as officers helped her sit upright. While searching the lodge, police discovered a blue leather-bound notebook that appeared to chronicle Fiona's mental decline. Parkin observed that the paper inside matched a handwritten farewell note she had left behind. A quick scan of the final page revealed unsettling references to vomiting and defecation, details that made it feel like a continuation of her goodbye. Fiona had also left behind her bank card and a handwritten note addressed to the lodge owner, one that even included her PIN, strongly implying she had no intention of surviving. Scrawled at the end of the message were 4 chilling words: "Don't go into the bathroom." After she was rushed to the hospital, investigators began to comb through her notebook more carefully while doctors worked to stabilize her. What they discovered inside its pages was far more disturbing than they had anticipated. The entries appeared to be a detailed confession to a murder. Initially, Constable Lawson dismissed the contents as nothing more than fragmented thoughts produced during a mental health crisis. "I believed these comments to be delusional fantasies," he later stated. "At that stage, I did not believe someone had actually been killed." Constable Roy Williams, another officer involved in the investigation, shared Lawson's early skepticism, but admitted that the material was deeply unsettling. In her notebook, Fiona wrote that her long-term partner was not a kind man, and then, without hesitation, claimed she had killed him. Given the disturbing nature of the journal, investigators could no longer dismiss it as mere emotional turmoil. The entries began to form a haunting narrative chronicling Fiona's unraveling mental state and the dark path that led to her alleged crime. One passage stood out with chilling clarity. "Everything changed last year. You'd be sweet to them, especially your wife." She followed that line with a harrowing reflection. "My husband wasn't sweet to me. I suppose I ought to explain how I got to this point." Fiona wrote candidly about her mental decline, describing how repeated infidelity would be followed by emotional abuse, criticism, belittling, and relentless moaning. Finally, her words reached a grim turning point. "I have to confess. Okay, here goes." Fiona's next words dove even deeper into the darkness. She recounted a disturbing incident from October 2021, claiming that Nick spat on her and made threats during an intimate moment. She admitted she had considered leaving him, but instead something inside her shifted. His behavior, she wrote, awakened a part of herself she referred to as Tulip 22, a name she gave to the alter ego that took control, reckless, fearless, efficient, ruthless. Her writings then laid out a chilling and calculated plan. Fiona described hitting her emotional breaking point on Halloween night in 2021. It was then she said that the decision was made. The ongoing pandemic offered her the perfect cover. Mandatory isolation would give her 10 uninterrupted days. On the following Monday, she contacted her school and reported that she and Nick had tested positive, securing the solitude she needed to put her plan into motion. He left for work while Tulip 22 smoked and schemed. I had run through the scenario in my mind countless times. She recounted setting up the bath, coaxing Nick to relax with the promise of intimacy later, and secretly tucking a knife into her dressing gown pocket. The note went on to say, "I brought a chisel, trash bags, and cable ties upstairs. I even convinced him to wear an eye mask before I stabbed him." In another entry, Fiona revealed her inner turmoil and guilt. "Still, I can't shake the memories. There are moments when I have to remind myself of what I did and the cover story I created, neither of which feels believable. Hiding a body was more difficult than I imagined. Moving one is much more challenging than it appears on TV. I obviously regret what I did. I'm not a monster, but it had been building up for such a long time." She expressed regret for not leaving Nick or standing up for herself sooner, writing, "I'm sorry I didn't leave him. I'm sorry I allowed him to destroy my self-esteem and sense of worth. I'm sorry I'm weak. I'm sorry for my actions." Most chillingly, Fiona mentioned that Nick had asked why. Just after she stabbed him, she ended with a grim reflection. "The ironic part is, he was such a repulsive person that all it took was sending a few texts, and no one seemed to care. I doubt anyone would have even looked for him." Nick Billingham was last seen on November 1st, 2021, after which he only communicated with his friends and family through text messages. The day after the police reviewed Fiona Beale's unsettling notebook entries, they searched the Moore Street house where she and Nick had lived. At first, there were no signs of anything unusual. However, when officers returned the next day, they found something troubling. In the cellar, a mattress was moved to reveal significant bloodstains. On March 19th, police carried out a more in-depth investigation and uncovered further evidence. Forensic teams, along with a cadaver dog, located a body buried in the backyard. Nick's remains were wrapped in a carpet and hidden beneath layers of bark chippings, soil, wooden sheeting, concrete blocks, bricks, and planks. The burial site also contained plastic bags, rubble, mortar, polystyrene, laminate flooring, fabric, and vinyl pieces. The body was concealed within a built structure and a sleep mask with the words, "This is my morning after face," printed on the inside, covered Nick's eyes. A police spokesperson strongly criticized the handling of Nick's body, stating, "The way he was wrapped in cables, hoses, and plastic bags among building debris left him with no dignity in death. It shows complete contempt." A post-mortem, conducted the day after the discovery, revealed that Nick had died from a single stab wound to the right side of his neck. The wound had severed his jugular vein and damaged his esophagus and trachea. The force needed to cause the injury was described as moderate, although severe force could not be ruled out. On March 22, 2022, Fiona Beale was arrested and charged with the murder of Nick Billingham. His family was heartbroken upon learning the truth. They were horrified to find that Fiona had used Nick's phone to send text messages to his friends and family after his death. Nick's mother shared one of these messages with journalists. In a public statement, his family said, "Nick has been taken from us far too early and will always remain in our hearts. We've been deeply touched by the overwhelming support and comforting words from so many wonderful people. Nick will be profoundly missed by his friends, family, and loved ones. Our hearts are broken for Nick. He was a beautiful little boy and we treasure the memories of him growing up. We are incredibly proud of the man he became." The shocking revelation of Fiona Beale's dark side stunned her colleagues and the parents of her students. The administration at the school where Fiona worked issued a statement expressing their disbelief. "We were shocked and saddened to learn that one of our teaching staff has been charged with a serious offense and is now in custody. This news will deeply affect our community, especially the children. We will do everything we can to support both students and staff as we navigate this difficult time. This tragedy has shaken our school community to its foundation, and we must come together to offer support and kindness to one another. As the investigation unfolded, police confirmed that Nick had died on November 1st, 2021. In the days that followed, Fiona tried to cover up her crime. She had carefully planned everything, knowing that claiming a positive COVID-19 test result would grant her a 10-day isolation period without interruption. Authorities believe Fiona fabricated her test results and submitted them through an online application. There is no evidence to suggest that she ever actually took the test. Additionally, her actions during those 10 days contradicted the severe symptoms she claimed to be experiencing. After the murder, Fiona set about the painstaking task of cleaning the crime scene, using the time she had strategically created to erase any evidence. By 1:07 a.m. on November 2nd, Fiona Beale, using both her deceased partner's Amazon account and her own, began ordering items to clean up and conceal the crime. These included supplies for Venetian blinds, a new mop and bucket, heavy-duty bin bags, a new mattress, bedding, clothing, wall art, and mirrors. Later that same day, Fiona updated a Tesco order to include several cleaning products and added 3 rolls of duct tape. At 2:19 p.m., she purchased long, heavy-duty gardening gloves, a stainless steel digging spade, and a galvanized incinerator bin designed for garden waste. She also made additional purchases for disposing of the body while treating herself to chocolates, scented candles, toiletries, soft furnishings, and clothing. Nearly 2 weeks after killing Nick Billingham, Fiona was captured on supermarket CCTV on November 13th, buying various building materials that would later be used to construct his grave. The footage was later released by police as part of their investigation. As previously mentioned, Fiona impersonated Nick for months by sending text messages to his family and friends. She even invited his mother, Miss Valentine, to her home for a Christmas drink on December 23, 2021, while Nick's body remained buried in the garden or trauma, and evidence suggested she was instead embracing what she described in a deleted file as a new life. It seemed that after killing a partner she disliked and suspected of infidelity, she was savoring her newfound freedom. During the trial, Fiona initially denied her guilt, later claiming the crime was involuntary. However, the prosecution painted a different picture. The prosecutor argued that Nick had been unfaithful to Fiona multiple times over their 17-year relationship, even fathering a child with another woman. Despite these betrayals, Fiona repeatedly took him back. The prosecution contended that rather than leaving Nick, Fiona carefully planned his murder, deciding when and how to kill him, where to hide his body, and how to explain both his disappearance and her absence from work. In contrast, Fiona's defense attorney, Andrew Wheeler, offered a different perspective. In his opening statement, Andrew Wheeler argued that Fiona had long struggled with mental health issues due to Nick's coercive behavior. He told the jury, "We submit that this case is not as straightforward as the prosecution suggests." Wheeler claimed that Beale had faced years of psychological manipulation from Billingham, which gradually wore her down. "We submit that she was worn down until she was quite literally broken," Wheeler stated. Beale herself claimed she couldn't recall many details of the act, yet she continued with her work as though nothing had happened, even participating in a school trip to London. However, weeks later, Beale began sending frequent messages to her head teacher, claiming she was unwell. In March, her head teacher became concerned and reached out to Beale's mother, who mentioned that Fiona had spoken of going on a school residential trip. The head teacher then reported her missing to the police. Officers located her at a rented lodge near Kendal, where Beale told them she just needed peace and quiet and didn't want her family to know where she was. 3 days later, she sent her family a troubling message. "I'm so sorry. I love you all very much." Ultimately, Beale changed her plea and admitted her guilt. During the trial at Northampton Crown Court, she spoke about her struggles and her relationship with Billingham. She claimed that he had thrown dinner plates against walls on 2 separate occasions, and made cleaning a constant source of tension, even criticizing how items were arranged in cupboards. Beale alleged that his behavior slowly eroded her confidence over the years, describing how what began as jokes gradually turned into hurtful remarks and cruelty. She also admitted that before the killing, She had told Billingham she would kill him to stop him from treating another woman the way he had treated her. However, the prosecutor argued that Beale's actions were premeditated, emphasizing how she had used Billingham's money to purchase items for cleaning and concealing the crime, including materials to bury him. The court also heard Beale's chilling words from her notebook, where she attempted to justify her actions, writing, "I'm not a total monster." Nick Billingham's family, devastated by his loss, expressed their deep grief and anger. His mother recalled how Beale had invited her for a Christmas drink, while Nick lay buried just feet away. "How could you hate someone so much to do what she did?" she said, adding that Nick's children would never have the chance to see their father again or share life's milestones with him. The judge sentenced Beale to a minimum of 20 years in prison, considering aggravating factors, but also adjusting for her guilty plea. Addressing her in court, he stated, "Your actions and deceit were driven entirely by self-preservation. You used his money to cover up your crime and showed no remorse." Nick's last reported word was "why," as Beale stabbed him in the neck, a tragic question that continues to haunt those who knew and loved him. Sarah Louise Yarborough was born on June 12, 1975 to Tom and Laura Yarborough in Portland, Oregon. At some point, her family would move to Federal Way, Washington, near her grandparents. As a sophomore, Sarah was an honors student and a member of the drill team. She loved art, ballet, and her friends. She was an excellent student who had already been to New Zealand twice for an educational outreach program. She was known to always have a book in her hand and was looking forward to college. On the morning of Saturday, December 14, 1991, tragedy would strike and her life would sadly be taken away by a monster. Sarah and her drill team were meeting up first thing in the morning at school to get on a bus that would take them to an event where they were supposed to perform. Sarah thought bus time was 8 to 8:30, but it was actually 9 to 9:30. So when she pulled into the school's back parking lot at 8:15 a.m., she was 45 minutes early. No one else was in the lot at the time, but there were a lot of people at the high school for various activities. At some point after she arrived, a jogger passing on a trail near the sports field noticed a man and a woman lying in the tall grass nearby. The jogger assumed it was a couple making out and continued jogging. He would pass them once more, but again, kept to his own business and jogged back to the parking lot. Minutes later, two 12-year-old boys were approaching the area and saw a man walking towards them out of the brush. When he looked up and noticed the boys, he quickly turned away from them and went another direction. They thought the guy was acting strange and continued walking in that direction and would eventually discover Sarah's body. They panicked and ran home to tell their parents. One of the boys' dads went to search for the Chevy Nova the kids said they thought the killer drove away in. The dad stopped at a nearby store parking lot and told someone to call police. Once he got back out to his car, he'd completely lost track of the Chevy. It was determined that she had been fatally attacked, but they were able to preserve DNA from the killer. When word began to spread about what had happened, tips began to pour in. The jogger and the boys described the man they saw as a white man in his 20s, about 6 foot tall, with shoulder-length blonde hair. He was wearing a dark trench coat and dark pants. When the Chevy Nova was tracked down and ended up being a guy that had pulled into the parking lot to eat breakfast. Even after his explanation, he was still investigated, but DNA would eventually rule him out. There were so many tips piling into police that they were having a hard time keeping up, and it was actually slowing them down. So Sarah's grandfather, John Holmquist, a scientist at Weyerhaeuser Company, got permission from his employment to loan the police department a $150,000 computer to help them collect, organize, and analyze all the tips law enforcement was receiving. Sarah would have graduated with her class in June of 1993. Her class raised $40,000 and a local sculptor created a bench dedicated to her. The bench was placed in front of Federal Way High School just 3 days before her class graduated. A replica of her belongings and of her beloved dog stands on the ground with his front paws up on the bench as if sniffing out Sarah's scent from her possessions. In 2011, the detective on the case reached out to genealogy research company Identifinders International. He asked them if they could perform a genealogy report on the suspect's DNA. Despite forensic genetic genealogy just beginning to grow, Colleen Fitzpatrick was still able to come to the conclusion that Sarah's killer was one of the descendants of Robert Fuller, who came from England to America on the Mayflower in 1638 at the age of 23. The investigator took this information and began to look for people with the surname Fuller in and around King County in 1991. He found a few Fullers and brought some pictures of them to the child witnesses from 20 years ago. But the boys who were over 30 by then didn't recognize any of the men from that morning in 1991. The investigator interviewed a few of the Fuller men in the area anyway and asked for their DNA samples, in which they agreed to provide. These samples were sent to the state crime lab and compared to the suspect's DNA. None of them were an exact match, but one man was actually determined to be a distant relative of the suspect. They shared enough DNA to be genetically linked on their father's sides. Fitzpatrick of Identifinders International knew they were cousins in some way, but didn't know how distant of cousins they were. After that, because of the limits in the field at the time, Identifinders' involvement in the case ended. Amazingly, this case helped in the development of forensic genetic genealogy as we know it today. In 2017, the detective reached out again to Identifinders, and they agreed to work further on the case using advancements that occurred over the past several years. After 27 years of police investigating thousands of tips and leads and swabbing 200 to 300 possible suspects, they finally had a possible match. On September 27, 2019, Fitzpatrick called the detective with names to look into as a possible owner of the DNA found on Sarah's clothes almost 28 years ago. They had zeroed in on two brothers, one born in 1958 and one born in 1964. Despite the older brother being a registered sex offender who had served time, his DNA was in Cody's and had never matched as a hit, so he was ruled out. The younger brother also had a history of sex-related crimes and lived in and around King County when Sarah was killed. Police began surveilling him and soon followed him to the laundromat, Lake Meridian Cleaners, near his home in Kent, Washington. While his clothes were laundering, he stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. Once done, he threw it on the ground and detectives confiscated the cigarette as evidence. But they decided to stay longer and was able to snatch another cigarette and a napkin that fell out of his pocket that he didn't bother picking up. During the surveillance at the laundromat, one of the detectives approached the suspect and asked him for directions. He learned that he goes by Leon, which is actually the suspect's middle name, not his first name. The evidence was sent to the crime lab for testing and a match was made. The next day, October 3, 2019, the King County Sheriff's Department announced the arrest of Patrick Leon Nicholas for the 1991 murder of 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough. Nicholas was born in 1964, and at the time of his arrest, he was living in Covington, Washington, just 12 miles from Federal Way High School. He had never been investigated in the murder case. One night in 1983, he had kidnapped a girl in her own car, and when he tried to get her out of the car, she was able to escape by jumping in the river and swimming downstream. Nicholas then bought a plane ticket and flew out of state, but police caught him and he served 3 or 4 years behind bars. Then, in 1994, he pleaded guilty to a gross misdemeanor assault in the 4th degree of a minor. Washington State had instituted a policy to collect DNA from its criminal offenders in 1990, but the gross misdemeanor conviction was not a high enough charge that would require him to submit his DNA. This may be why he pleaded guilty to avoid risking a higher charge and having his DNA placed into Cody's. Since his biological grandfather had been adopted, it had made the genetic genealogy harder to navigate. He was arrested and given a $5 million bail, but pleaded not guilty to the murder. Thankfully, Sarah's family finally has some closure. On May 25, 2003, a hiker's dog discovered a skull on a slope 1,000 feet above the ski resort Mammoth Lakes in California. Days later, more remains were found at the top of a ridge called Mammoth Knolls near Shady Rest Park. The San Francisco Medical Examiner's Office determined that the victim had been killed around the fall of 2002, less than a year earlier. Was later determined to be the remains of a female between the ages of 30 and 40 years old. Her teeth were in poor condition and she had likely received little to no dental care during her life. It was also discovered that she had given birth at least once in her life. For the first time in criminal investigation history, Forensic isotope testing was performed on the remains in a Canadian lab to estimate the locations where the victim spent time in based on the water she drank. This paired with the DNA testing revealed that she was likely born and raised as a child in Southern California or Northern Mexico and had later moved to Southern Mexico or Oaxaca, where she lived for about a decade. Her diet was described as very poor, and she had consumed a significant amount of corn. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Mammoth Lake's Jane Doe. Detective Paul Dostie of the Mammoth Lakes Police Department led the investigation. He contacted Dr. Philip Walker, a physical anthropologist at the UCSB and an expert in prehistoric Native Americans, to help him on the case. Dr. Walker believed that the San Francisco Medical Examiner had performed an inadequate autopsy because there was no official cause of death. It's presumed that snow covering the burial site prevented an earlier discovery. Mitochondrial DNA testing was performed of the victim, which showed that she was of Zapotec Indian descent from the Oaxaca village. Investigators traveled to this location twice, looking for answers to her identity, but were unsuccessful. However, days after the discovery, a park ranger working at the Mammoth Lakes Visitor Center came forward to state that he recalled a woman who had visited the area in the fall of 2002 with a man, possibly her husband. He said she was a very petite woman, possibly Asian, and she appeared afraid of the man she was with, who was heavyset and had a bushy mustache. At one point, she had told a park ranger that he was abusive towards her and wouldn't let her go. She was then given a Wild Iris Domestic Violence Services card. Her husband asked questions about the regulations of the campground and how long visitors were allowed to stay. He was described as abrasive and mean-spirited. From the descriptions, they were able to create composite sketches of the couple. The victim's face was reconstructed by Betty Pat Gatliff, a noted Oklahoma forensic artist who specializes in 3D facial reconstructions. The photograph was printed on flyers that were distributed throughout the Oaxaca community in Los Angeles. Also, Ray Morales, president of the Oaxacan Businessmen's Association, distributed the flyers in the area. In 2006, the woman on the flyer was falsely identified as Barbara Pacheco Santiago by her stepmother, who had not seen her for over 7 years. Santiago's biological parents have been dead for many years, and her stepmother said Pacheco Santiago had 2 sons, neither of whom have been located. It would be years before this false identification was corrected. 18 years later, on August 31, 2021, using DNA advancement, her identity was finally determined to be 30-year-old Isabel Sanchez Bernal. Her suspected killer was also announced as Diego Santiago Hernandez Antonia, and he was arrested for her murder. Isabel was from Pueblo, Mexico, but had been living in California for about 2 years prior to her death. Hernandez Antonia is a local from the town of Mammoth Lakes where Isabel's body was found. It is unclear what his relationship was to her, and police are asking anyone who knows the couple to come forward. But as of now, Isabel has her name back and her killer remains behind bars. On May 13, 1988, a man mowing with a tractor discovered a body in St. Lucie County, Florida, off Route 70. The body was found under a grapefruit tree in a grove area west of McCarty Road and south of Okeechobee Road. Also found nearby were 3 20-gauge shotgun shells. The body belonged to an unidentified man who was found wearing a wedding ring. 3 bullet wounds were found that resulted in his death. Investigators met with a witness 11 days after the discovery of the body. He stated that the remains probably belonged to 25-year-old Rocky Lane Taylor of Alabama. He said that he had been friends with Rocky and Michael Lewis Akins, and they had lived with him in his trailer at the 3900 block of South Hector Canal Road in Fort Pierce, Florida, for 4 weeks. He stated that Rocky and Michael had been in a tumultuous and toxic relationship consisting of physical and verbal fights. He said that Michael often accused Rocky of being an alcoholic hustler and using people for money. Rocky was often angry at Michael for acting in a feminine manner while they were in public. Michael allegedly stated that he was fed up with Rocky using him. Rocky had also conned others by marrying a 52-year-old woman and 2 other women long enough to spend their money. The man said in December 1987, Michael shot Rocky with a .25 caliber pistol during an altercation. Hospital records showed Rocky was brought in with a superficial gunshot wound but left before being treated. The man said he had made Michael and Rocky move out around April 1st, 1988 because of the alcohol and constant fighting, but they returned weeks later asking to move back in, but he wouldn't allow it. He said their fights often resulted in injuries and Michael often threatened to kill Rocky. In May of 1988, Michael returned to the trailer and tried to sell him a shotgun. When asked where Rocky was, Michael allegedly stated that he was gone for good and would never be able to bother him anymore, claiming he had shot him. In June of 1988, investigators spoke with Michael at his parents' home in Okeechobee County. When they told him about the homicide, he began screaming and became very uncooperative and even became abusive when his mother came out of the house and came to his side. A later interview with him was described as basically fruitless, with Michael just wanting to talk about his love for Rocky. He said they took long walks in the area where Rocky's body was found and agreed that they often got in violent arguments but always made up. Despite these claims, no arrest was made and Rocky's identity would go undetermined for the next 33 years, mostly because his friends were unable to identify the clothing on his body as belonging to him. Investigators at the time had a strong idea Michael was responsible, but prosecutors denied a warrant because the medical examiner's office couldn't make the identification. Over 30 years later, an investigator tracked down two of Rocky's brothers, one in Texas and one in Alabama. They agreed to DNA testing to find out if the remains indeed belonged to their brother Rocky. In 2021, after a long delay due to COVID-19, the results finally came back indicating the remains were in fact Rocky Lane Taylor. Weeks later, the match was publicized and according to police, there is sufficient evidence to make an arrest. However, the agency's cold case detective closed the case against Michael because he passed away with cancer in 2015. 33 years to the day, Rocky's surviving family members had a celebration of life for Rocky in their home state of Alabama. Around 1960, Jerry Barnett was born to Anna Mary Barnett, who was a teenager at the time. Her family members often helped care for Jerry while she worked, but one day Anna Mary left him with a babysitter that she didn't know very well. On that day in 1965, she returned to pick up 5-year-old Jerry from the babysitter, but was shocked to discover that she had moved and taken Jerry with her. The babysitter allegedly took him to Delaware and then later abandoned him. He would then become a ward of the state and placed into the foster care system. He was given the last name Thomas and an estimated date of birth because there were no records on him or his family available to the foster care system. Several years ago, Damon Parker, Jerry's son, took a DNA test for a genealogy website and matched with a cousin named Will Barnett in Kentucky. The two connected and Damon learned of his father's history. In 2020, Damon and his father Jerry drove from Delaware to Kentucky where Jerry would reunite with his mother after 55 years. They had a joyous reunion with many family members and she showed her son his birth certificate. Anna Mary stated she had reached out for help from agencies to locate Jerry, but this was during the civil rights movement and some agencies even sadly turned her away. To this day, the family is continuing to make up for all the years of lost time. In January 2022, it was announced that police in Colorado had solved the murders of 3 women and a teenage girl by using familial DNA and genetic genealogy. The victims were 53-year-old Dolores Brajas, 33-year-old Madeline Livaday, 27-year-old Gwendolyn Harris, and 17-year-old Antoinette Parks, and were all killed between 1978 and 1981 in the Denver, Colorado area. Initially, investigators were working on each cold case separately, but between 2013 and 2018, these 4 cases were linked together by DNA evidence. They were all linked to one possible suspect, Joe Michael Irvin. In 2019, the Denver Police Crime Laboratory learned of an ancestry link in Texas to the suspect. The link was discovered while doing a search in Texas records for biological relatives of the killer's DNA profile. Then in 2021, authorities exhumed Irvin's body from an Arlington cemetery and used DNA to confirm he had, in fact, killed the 4 females. The killing stopped in June of 1981 when Deborah Sue Core, an Aurora police officer, pulled Irvin over in a traffic stop in what was the first line of duty death for the Aurora Police Department. He also wounded bystander Glenn Spies when Spies witnessed the incident and tried to intervene. He would take his own life 4 days later while in custody for her murder. Irvin's criminal history began in October of 1969 when he was indicted for the August 8, 1969 murder of 21-year-old Rodney Jean Bonham at the since-demolished Berry Bowl off East Berry Street in Fort Worth, Texas. Colorado police did not connect Irvin to the Texas arrest warrant because his birth year had been entered incorrectly into NCIC, and also because he had adopted the surname Irving instead of Irvin after fleeing to Colorado. Those mistakes would cost the lives of multiple women. Dolores Barajas was killed when she was a 53-year-old wife, mother, and grandmother. She was fatally attacked while walking to work. She was visiting family in Denver that summer and working at a hotel downtown. The Sunday she was killed was supposed to be her last day of work before she returned home. On August 10, 1980, after her death, her body was found lying in the street on the 500 block of East 17th Avenue. Police have not released a photo of Dolores at her family's request. In January of 1981, Irvin allegedly killed a 17-year-old girl named Antoinette Parks. On January 24, 1981, Adams County deputies found her body in a field near 64th Avenue and Broadway. She had also been fatally attacked. She loved music and her family described her as caring, determined, and loved children. Madeline Livaday grew up in Central Florida, one of 5 sisters, and was an avid swimmer. She attended high school in Florida and graduated from Tulane University. Prior to getting married, she led an adventurous life traveling to Africa and Europe as part of her work as an editor on the beloved children's magazine, Ranger Rick. Madeline was the first victim killed on December 7, 1978, when she was a 33-year-old mother of 2. An unknown man came to her door on Poplar Street in Denver while she was cooking breakfast for her children and fatally attacked her. Gwendolyn Harris was found fatally attacked when she was a 27-year-old mother. She was last seen at a lounge in downtown Denver about a block away from Irvin's residence. Her family described her as a bright, soft-spoken, and athletic woman. On December 21, 1980, after her death, her body was found near East 47th Avenue and Andrews Drive in Denver's Montbello neighborhood. Madeline's daughters and the brothers of Antoinette were present for the announcement in early 2022 and spoke to reporters. They said they were experiencing a roller coaster of emotions after finding out who killed their family member, but were thankful for finally having some closure. In 1982, 29-year-old Barbara Jo Oberholzer, who went by the nickname Bobby Joe, lived near the small ski town of Breckenridge, Colorado. She was an avid animal lover, very soft-spoken, and had moved from Wisconsin to Colorado because of her love for the mountains and animals in the state. Bobby Jo worked as a receptionist, and on January 6, 1982, she received a pay raise and went to celebrate with friends that evening at the Village Pub in Breckenridge. When she called her husband, Jeff, after 6 p.m. to let him know, he asked her if she wanted him to pick her up, but she said she already had a ride and would be home shortly. He then made dinner and waited for her to come home. It was common in 1982 to hitchhike around the Breckenridge area, something Bobby Jo did frequently. On this particular day, she had left home at 7:15 a.m., hitchhiked to work, and worked all day. So after a few drinks with friends, she was tired and ready to make the 16-mile trip home to Alma where her husband Jeff and 11-year-old daughter were. But her friends were not ready to leave. So around 7:30 p.m. she told them she was going to hitchhike home and went to the nearby designated common area known for hitchhikers to wait for rides. Meanwhile, that same evening, 21-year-old Annette Schnee had a short break between her 2 jobs at the Holiday Inn in Frisco, where she cleaned rooms during the day, and at night, she worked as a waitress at the Flipside Bar in Breckenridge. After high school, Annette spent a year at a modeling school in Nebraska known as Patricia Stevens College. She then decided that she wanted to become an airline attendant and was working her way to that dream. She was scheduled to be at work at 8 p.m. at the Flipside Bar and was seen about 5 p.m. leaving a pharmacy in Breckenridge, and she had stopped to talk to an unidentified woman. It's speculated that she likely planned to hitchhike home, which was only 4 miles away in Blue River. That night, Bobby Jo would not arrive home to her husband and daughter, and Annette would not arrive for her shift at 8 p.m. Although it's not believed that the 2 women were acquaintances, They both worked in Breckenridge, and like many people in the 80s and in the area, they often hitchhiked, which they likely did this evening, but unknowingly got in the killer's vehicle and met their demise. The next day, Bobby Joe's driver's license was found by a rancher who called and notified Jeff. Soon after, Jeff and a friend began driving in that direction, when they noticed a backpack in the distance off the road. Hours later, her body was found off US 285 in the snow on the summit of Hoosier Pass. She had been fatally shot, and one wrist contained a pair of zip ties, and it was determined that she had bled out and froze to death. Found nearby was a single orange sock and her keychain with a hook made for her by Jeff so it could be used as a self-defense weapon. This was strange because Bobby Joe was wearing both her socks. Jeff had found her backpack about 20 miles from the crime scene on US 285. Found inside was Bobby Joe's bloody glove and tissue that also contained blood. It was evident from the footprints in the fresh snow that she had likely broken free from her killer and was chased down and shot at close range. Her husband, Jeff, was the first person of interest in the case, not only because it was standard procedure, but because many found it strange that he was the person that located some of her belongings and touched and contaminated them. Soon after, it was learned that Annette had also gone missing the night before, same as Bobby Joe. About 6 months later, on July 3, 1983, a man and his 9-year-old son were fishing at Sacramento Creek when the boy found a fully clothed woman's body partially submerged. She had been fatally shot as well, but investigators could not locate a bullet. During the autopsy, something strange stuck out to the CBI agent attending the procedure. An orange sock on her left foot appeared to match the one found near Bobby Joe's body months earlier. A long striped sock was on her right foot, and the matching sock was found in the pocket of her sweatshirt. Annette's mother told the police that the orange socks belonged to her daughter. It speculated that Annette was killed first and one of her socks was left behind. Then, when Bobby Joe was murdered hours later and dumped, the killer threw the matching sock out with her stuff. The investigators believed that the cases were obviously related. They desperately wanted to speak to the unidentified woman whom Annette was seen talking to outside the pharmacy right before she went missing, but she could never be located. Also, the location where Annette's body was discarded was in an area that likely only locals would know about. Therefore, they pulled a list of all local registered sex offenders and began attempting to rule them out one by one. A couple of months later, Annette's backpack was found along Highway 9. Strangely, inside was a business card from Jeff's repair business, along with a picture of an unknown man. The focus then centered on Bobby Joe's husband, Jeff, who was home in Alma the night his wife and Annette went missing, an alibi later verified. He stated that the reason she had his business card was that he had given her a ride in the past while she was hitchhiking. Years later, the blood found on Bobby Joe's glove and the bloody tissue was tested, and although it did belong to a man, it did not belong to her husband. After 2 lie detector tests that Jeff had taken and passed, along with his alibi and DNA test, it was finally determined that he was not their killer and the business card was merely a coincidence. After a DNA profile was created, many of the suspects in the case were ruled out. The DNA was entered into Cody's, but no matches were found. Meanwhile, one man remained at the top of their suspect list, Tom Luther. About 6 weeks after Bobby Joe and Annette disappeared, Luther was arrested for a brutal physical and sexual attack on a woman he offered a ride to while claiming to be a cab driver in Summit County. Luther went to prison for the attack and was released, and then arrested again following the 1993 murder of 20-year-old Cher Elder, who was last seen leaving a casino in Central City, Colorado. Years later, investigators learned that while he was behind bars in 1982, before Annette's body was discovered, he told other inmates that he had killed 2 young women near Breckenridge and that the authorities would never find the second girl's body. The 2 lead investigators, P.I. Charlie McCormick and Officer Richard Eaton, verified the inmates' claims. They then flew to West Virginia, where Luther was serving prison time for a separate rape case, to question him. He angrily denied any involvement in the women's deaths. He then remarked, "They aren't my girls," and reminded the investigators that his weapon of choice was a hammer, not a gun, and they were looking at the wrong man. Also, once his DNA was tested, it did not match the male DNA from Bobby Joe's glove. Beginning in 1999, A task force of 5 people came together to try to solve the murders and began meeting yearly to discuss updates. Then finally, when forensic genetic genealogy exploded, the DNA profile was used to track down a likely suspect. A genealogist created a family tree of over 12,000 people and narrowed it down to possible offenders in the area around the time of the murders. Finally, one name was given to investigators who then surveilled the man for weeks, hoping to get a DNA sample. They were successful and it was a match. On February 24, 2021, 38 years after the murders, Alan Lee Phillips was arrested for the murders of Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette Schnee and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, assault, and kidnappings. He was a father of 3 and had worked as a mechanic and at the time of his arrest was living west of Denver in Clear Creek County. Interestingly, the night he committed the double murders, his truck became stuck in a snowdrift on a mountain pass and he was helped after signaling SOS with his headlights. A passenger in a plane overhead rescued him and questioned why he had taken such a dangerous road in the freezing temperatures. He said he was coming back from a bar and was even interviewed about the incident in a local newspaper. Many believe that although Phillips has no criminal record, he was likely involved in other slayings because it's hard to believe he killed 2 women hours apart and didn't harm anyone else for the next 4 decades. Annette's 88-year-old mother and Bobby Joe's husband were relieved to witness an arrest in their loved ones' deaths. Cynthia Renee Rogers was described by her mother, Rosia Rogers, as very petite, a free spirit, and loved watching birds and taking long walks. At 27, she was a biologist researching Parkinson's disease at the National Institutes of Health on the St. Elizabeth's Hospital campus in Washington, D.C. Cynthia, who was from D.C., was living in Forestville, Maryland at 6401 Pennsylvania Avenue, number 204. On Super Bowl Sunday, January 22, 1989, Cynthia headed to the local market to purchase some items to make soup. On her way there, she decided to take a shortcut and was viciously attacked and murdered. It would be 5 days before her body was discovered. On January 27, 1989, she was found in the 6,000 block of Surrey Square Lane Service Road in Forestville. She was left on a dirt path littered with trash in an area that locals frequently used as a shortcut to the store less than a mile from her home. She had been beaten and raped before being strangled to death. Sadly, the case would go cold for the next 33 years. A small amount of DNA was collected from her body and preserved. That DNA was used years later in 2018 to exclude several suspects. However, there wasn't a strong enough sample to submit to CODIS. Then in 2020, Prince George County won a grant for almost $500,000. The money would be used for costly DNA tests in hopes of solving cases dating back to 1979, and the county has an abundance of unsolved cases with DNA on file waiting to be tested. In early 2022, Cynthia's case was chosen for additional testing. A lab was able to produce a complete, unidentified male profile. A search of the state of Maryland DNA database resulted in a positive match to 64-year-old James Clinton Cole. According to reports, Cole would have been 32 years old at the time of Cynthia's murder, and there is no reason to believe the two knew each other. Cole was then charged with first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and several additional charges. He had a criminal record and was already in prison when he was identified as her killer. Cole is currently in prison for forcing a 12-year-old girl at knife point into the woods behind Stoddard Middle School in Maryland in 1996. He then sexually assaulted her and left her tied to a tree. Thankfully, she was able to escape, but it changed her life forever. It would take 14 long years before DNA could identify Cole in that case. He was then charged and sentenced to 2 life sentences. He will likely perish behind bars where he remains in Cumberland, Maryland. Thankfully, his victim's family can now have closure. You just forget the war for a moment and come with us to South Australia. On December 1st, 1948, locals saw what they assumed was a man sleeping off a night of too much drinking on Somerton Park Beach, a seaside suburb of Adelaide, Australia. He was found lying on his back in the sand across from the crippled children's home on the corner of the Esplanade and Bickford Terrace. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed, double-breasted suit and tie. His shoes were freshly shined, and his head rested propped up on the seawall. His feet were crossed and he had a cigarette on his collar. Later that morning, the same witnesses noticed that the man had not moved. So a man named John Lyons took a closer look and discovered he was deceased. The post-mortem exam showed signs of some type of poisoning. His spleen was enlarged, his liver was swollen with blood, and blood was found in his stomach. In other words, he was bleeding internally. But there were no signs of injury on the outside of the body. He had last eaten a pasty a few hours before his death that could have been poisoned. However, many tests were done to prove this theory, but no trace of any non-poisons was detected. Police made a plaster cast bust of the John Doe in hopes of future identification. Blood pooling to the back of his head proved that it had been in that position for many hours after his death, possibly since 2 a.m. the morning of his discovery. According to the pathologist John Burton Cleland, the man was of British appearance and thought to be aged between 40 and 45 years old. Also, he was found to be in top physical condition. Found inside his pockets was an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach. There was also a bus ticket from the city that may not have been used, a comb that had been manufactured in the USA, a pack of juicy fruit chewing gum, an Army Club cigarette packet that contained 7 cigarettes of different brands, and a quarter-full box of Bryant and May matches. All labels on his clothes had been removed and he had no wallet or hat, which was unusual for 1948. He was clean-shaven, and police initially believed that he had committed suicide. In an attempt to identify the person, investigators checked for dental records, but a match could not be found and he became known as the Somerton Man or the Unknown Man. Witnesses said the night before they had seen an individual resembling the dead man lying on his back in the same spot where the corpse was later found. A couple who saw him at around 7 p.m. noted that they saw him extend his right arm to its fullest extent and then drop it limply. Another couple who saw him from 7:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., during which time the streetlights had come on, recounted that they did not see him move during the half an hour in which he was in view. However, they did acknowledge that it was odd he was not reacting to the mosquitoes, but nevertheless, they thought he was more than likely drunk or asleep, so they went about their way. Another witness came forward in 1959 and reported to the police that he had seen a well-dressed man carrying another man on his shoulders along Somerton Park Beach the night before the body was found. On the same day of the discovery, the advisor reported the discovery of the body, giving his identification as possibly being E.C. Johnson of Arthur Street, Paynham. The next day, Johnson arrived at the police station and cleared up the misidentification. By early February 1949, there had been 8 different positive identifications of the body, which were all later proven false. For months after his discovery, a piece of paper was found tucked into a fog pocket of his trousers. It was a small piece of paper torn from the final page of a copy of the poem titled, authored by 11th and 12th century Persian poet Omar Khayyam and translated in 1859 by Edward Fitzgerald, a popular book at the time. The torn paper contained the Persian phrase, "Tamam should," meaning is over or is finished. This led to the mysterious case being known as the Tamam Shud case. Months later, the book from which the page had been torn was located. A doctor came forward and said it had been thrown into his car parked near the same beach where the man had been found. He said he often left the windows of his car open and thought little of it until he read about the search for the book in the paper. To add to the mystery, on the inside back cover was a local telephone number, another unidentified number, and text that resembled a coded message that still hasn't officially been decoded. The phone number X3239 turned out to be that of a nurse in training named Jessica Ellen Thompson. She lived at 90A Glenelg Street, just 200 yards from where he was discovered. Also, she reportedly worked at the home for crippled children located in front of where the body was found. Much of the case would become centered around Jessica Thompson. When interviewed, she denied knowing the man and was very evasive. When shown the cast of his face by police, she appeared shocked and looked away and wouldn't look back. She stated that she had given a copy of the Rubaiyat to Alfred Boxall, an Australian Army lieutenant who she had met at the Clifton Gardens Hotel in Sydney in 1944. She reportedly gave him the copy over drinks at the hotel prior to him going overseas to serve in World War II. Boxall was tracked down the next day and was very much alive, and his copy of the book of poetry was intact. While being questioned, She requested that her real name be withheld because she didn't want her husband to know she knew Alf Boxall. But it turns out that she was not yet married to Prosper Thompson. She and Thompson didn't marry until May 1950, a year and a half later, because he had to wait for his divorce from his wife Queenie to be final. Jessica had given birth to a son named Robin Thompson out of wedlock in July 1947. She gave him the surname Thompson because she was unmarried and because of the stigma of an unmarried woman having a child. She had to leave her nurse training at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney due to the pregnancy. It became suspected that Robin was the biological son of either the Somerton man or Alfred Boxall and passed off as Prosper Thompson's son. After being tediously analyzed, it was suggested that the code found on the piece of paper in his pocket was more than likely an acrostic rather than a cipher. This is because its letter frequencies differed considerably from letters written down randomly. The format of the code also appeared to follow the quatrain format of the Rabayit, supporting the theory that the code was a one-time pad encryption algorithm. This was one of the reasons many were led to believe that he was a Cold War-era spy. Unable to determine his identity, he would go unidentified for the next 74 years. His case has baffled professional and amateur detectives around the world since 1948. 6 weeks after the man's discovery, a suitcase containing his property was retrieved from Adelaide railway station's cloakroom. It had been checked in at around 11 a.m. the day before his death and included a dressing gown, slippers, underpants, shaving supplies, pajamas, trousers with sand in the cuffs, and some tools and instruments. You could say the tools could be used for hot wiring vehicles and breaking and entering, but no evidence points to him being a criminal. However, apart from 3 items marked Keen, 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 and T. Keen, nothing indicating the man's identity was found in those belongings. Also, nobody with that name was reported missing. There was also a Barber brand thread card that wasn't available in Australia. It was orange and had been used to repair the lining in his trousers pocket. Forensic VR specialist Daniel Voshart created his visual representation of the Somerton man. The man's fingerprints and photographs were sent worldwide, and a letter signed by FBI Director John Edgar Hoover confirmed the U.S. had found no match for his fingerprints in its files. Jessica Thompson, the nurse questioned by police regarding the Rabayit she had given away, later died in 2007. However, 6 years later, her daughter, Kate Thompson, was interviewed for the Australian 60 Minutes Current Affairs TV program. Kate revealed that her mother had a dark side. Kate said her mother had told her that she indeed did know more about the Somerton man, but had deliberately not revealed it to the police. Jessica told her it was a mystery that was only known to a level higher than the police force. She also revealed that her mother could speak Russian, which suggested that she may have been involved in some spy-related activity. She also taught English to migrants and was interested in communism. Kate said she always wondered if her mother was responsible for the man's death. It was also of note that the copy of the book Jessica had given away had been signed with the name Justin. Her daughter, Kate, said that some of her nursing pals, all those decades earlier, called her Tina. A card sent to her in her later years from her nursing pals said, "Dear Tina, Tina," or "Dear Tina, Tina." Her mother explained this as just "together with Tina and you have Justin." On May 19, 2021, after years of denied requests to do so, the body was exhumed for DNA collection. A hair trapped in his death mask made of plaster was used to create a DNA profile. This profile was used for genetic genealogy research performed by Australian researcher and Adelaide University physicist, Professor Derek Abbott, along with renowned American genealogist, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Abbott began investigating the identity of the Somerton man over a decade ago with his conscripted students at the University of Adelaide and using the book written about the case by ex-detective Gary Feltz, the cold case investigator. They built a complex family tree of around 4,000 names that finally led to the man's identity, whose date of death had not been recorded. They initially found a first cousin 3 times removed and matched DNA obtained from his hair to DNA tests taken from his distant relatives. Finally, after 74 years, they determined the Somerton man's identity and announced it on July 26, 2022. They determined that the man was Carl Charles Webb, born November 16, 1905, and the youngest of 6. Charles was a 43-year-old electrical engineer and instrument maker from Footscray in Melbourne, Australia. Little is known about his early life, but he married Dorothy Jean Robertson, known as Daph Webb, in October 1941, and abandoned her in April 1947. They had no non-children together. Webb had resided in Victoria and had a brother-in-law, Thomas Keane, who lived about 20 minutes away from him, explaining the name on some of the clothes. But 4 months after applying for a divorce for desertion, she placed an ad for him in Melbourne's Missing Friends section of the Aged newspaper. It was a formal notice to make him aware of divorce proceedings, and if he didn't appear on the scheduled court date, the case might proceed in his absence. She was finally granted a divorce in April 1952. Dove Webb applied for divorce nearly 3 years after his body was found. She said he had suffered several devastating tragedies before disappearing. The documents showed 4 of his close relatives died within 7 years. He lost a brother and nephew in World War II. His father died in 1939 and his mother died in 1946. She stated that he was rude and unpleasant at times, refusing to speak to her, but lived a quiet life being in bed by 7 p.m. each night. She claimed that one night in January 1946, he told her they were not suited for each other and would be better apart. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, an expert with Identifinders International who helped identify the Somerton man, said Mrs. Webb's claims are only half the story. She suspects that Webb had mental health issues and would spiral down. Confirming Webb's name raises many more questions about who he was and how he died. No death record for Webb exists, and his last known records date to April 1947 when he left his wife. She later moved to Butte, South Australia, 89 miles from Adelaide, and he had possibly been trying to track her down. Abbott's research indicates Webb enjoyed betting on horses, thus the coded messages could be horses' names. Webb was also fond of poetry and had written some of his own, explaining the To Mom Should poem. Unfortunately, researchers have not been able to locate any photos of Webb before his death. In 2009, Professor Abbott consulted with dental experts who concluded the Somerton man had a very rare genetic disorder of hypodontia affecting his incisor teeth. University of Adelaide professor of anatomy, Masha Kenneberg, assessed photos of his ears and found a feature possessed by only 1 to 2% of the population. A photo of Robin showed he shared both these anomalies. Experts say the ears are telling signs of whether two people are related. The chance of coincidence is estimated at between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 20,000. In addition, both Robin and Webb shared very muscular calves similar to ballet dancers, which Robin was. In 2009, Professor Abbott tried to find Jessica Thompson, whose phone number had come from the Mystery Man's poetry book. Unfortunately, she died in 2007 and her son Robin died in 2009. Robin turned out to have been a professional ballet dancer whose teeth and ears were said to be remarkably similar to the Somerton man's. However, Abbott eventually found and interviewed that man's daughter, Rachel Egan. He first wrote her a letter about her possible relation to the Somerton man, and then the two met at a fancy restaurant in Brisbane. The two then fell in love and got married the following year in 2010. They are now happily married with 3 children. However, once Rachel's DNA was tested, she was linked to being related to Prosper Thompson, not Carl Webb. She also learned during the process that she was adopted and Robin, who she had never met, was her biological father. Rachel made contact with her biological mother, Roma Egan, and soon moved to Brisbane to be with her. She learned her parents had met when they were both dancers at the Australian Ballet School. Her father, Robin, got a job with the Royal New Zealand Ballet Company and Roma went with him to New Zealand. Roma then became pregnant, but she and Robin didn't have the means to keep her, so they put her up for adoption. Rachel's mother was suspicious of her relationship with Professor Abbott. Not only did it move very quickly, but she feared he was just out for her DNA or maybe just wanted to bear children with her so they could share the same DNA as the Somerton man that had become his sole focus for many years. This caused the newly introduced mother and daughter to become quickly estranged. While the Somerton man has been identified, his cause of death remains a mystery, one that we will likely never know. Kim Everett Kirk was born January 12, 1970, and was one of 3 daughters. She met David Neal Cox through a friend at work around the year 2000, and initially he was a nice guy. They quickly married and he became a stepfather to Kim's 2 daughters, and the couple went on to have 2 sons together. Cox was a truck driver, but following a back injury and a prescription for painkillers, he left the workforce and qualified for disability. He then became addicted to meth and started abusing Kim. Due to the drugs, his behavior and personality had suddenly changed. At some point, Cox had even gone as far as manufacturing his own meth. In 2009, when her daughter Lindsay confessed to her mother that Cox had been sexually assaulting her for a few years, Kim finally decided to divorce him. But this instilled fear into Kim, and she made plans for her and the kids to take refuge at a women's shelter out of fear that Cox would retaliate. Kim took the children and left and pressed charges against Cox, and when deputies arrived to the home, Cox was arrested for statutory rape, sexual battery, and child abuse. They also found the precursors to make meth. Kim, still deathly afraid of her estranged husband, moved her and the children in with her sister, Christy Simon. While in the county jail, he told other prisoners that if he ever got out, he would kill his wife. However, unable to raise bond money, he remained in jail for 9 months. During that time, he often made threatening phone calls and would tell her he was coming for her. Suddenly, in April 2010, his bond was significantly reduced, allowing him to raise enough funds to get out. The family only learned he had been released when a friend saw him on the street and called Kim. She then went to the Chancery Court and got protective orders against him in Lee, Pontotoc, and Union counties. Now that he was out, he would sometimes drive by her home and point his finger at her and simulate a gun. Then about 7 p.m. on May 14, 2010, tragedy would strike. 12-year-old Lindsay was sitting on the couch while her mom's sister, Christy, was cooking dinner, and one of her brothers was playing basketball outside. Her mother, Kim, was in the back of the house preparing a bath for her youngest son. That's when Cox shot through the screen door of the home in Sherman, Mississippi, before barging inside and ordering Lindsay not to move. He then chased her aunt out of the house. He then found Kim and shot her twice. Her youngest son would frantically run to a closet. Meanwhile, Aunt Christy called Kim's parents and told them what was happening. Cox called her parents and told them it was all their fault he was arrested and he had planned to kill all of them. Kim's father and stepmother, Benny and Melody Kirk, then had to serve as negotiators on the phone with Cox. They could hear Cox taunting Kim as she was dying and belittling her, and said he wanted to sit there and watch her suffer. Kim was able to talk on the phone briefly to her father while she lay on the floor bleeding to death and said, "Daddy, I'm dying." She was still hanging on to life at midnight. He had barricaded the 4 of them inside the home and physically and mentally tortured the family, and told law enforcement he planned to kill the children and then himself. When he stopped talking to law enforcement at 3:23 a.m., officers stormed the house and arrested him. Kim was sadly already deceased during those nearly 9 hours of holding the children hostage. Cox sexually assaulted his stepdaughter, Lindsay, 3 times in front of her dying mother, even as police surrounded the home. 2 years later, he pleaded guilty to capital murder, kidnapping, and several other felonies related to the standoff and was sentenced to death. He then began years of appealing his conviction and sentence. He then made plans to waive his appeals and proceed with the execution, which infuriated Lindsay as she wanted him to sit in prison and reflect on what he did to her and her family. Lindsay has allowed her name to be made public to tell her story. On November 17, 2021, 50-year-old Cox died by lethal injection at the Mississippi State Penitentiary, and Lindsay, now 23, was there to witness it. He became the first Mississippi inmate to be put to death in 9 years. In the days prior to his scheduled execution, Cox made a shocking confession. He said that he had been the one that killed his sister-in-law, Felicia Cox, who was married to his brother. On November 19th, 2 days after his execution, his attorneys hand-delivered a letter in which Cox confessed to the murder and gave details of where her body is located. Felicia had been missing since July 2, 2007, after making a visit to Kim and David Cox's home. Her remains were found where he said they'd be in Pontotoc County on his family's former property. He had been a person of interest in Felicia's disappearance, but authorities had no evidence at the time. Kim's father and stepmother raised Lindsay and her 2 younger brothers after Kim's death, and one of his sons still has fear that he will come after them, even knowing that he is no longer breathing the air that he didn't deserve. Anna Maria Wilson was born on May 18, 1996 in Littleton, New Hampshire to Eric and Karen Wilson. She grew up in Kirby, Vermont and went by Mo and was a gifted multisport athlete. She was the captain of her high school soccer team and was a nationally ranked junior skier, placing 3rd in the 2013 U.S. Junior National Championship downhill event. After college, she transitioned from skiing to biking, and at the age of 25, she was a professional bike racer and worked as a demand planner for Specialized. She enjoyed cooking, riding, and traveling, especially to Italy. She recently excelled at gravel racing, a relatively new category of cycling that some consider a hybrid of road cycling and mountain biking. On May 10, 2022, a profile in Bello News referred to her as the winningest woman in the American off-road scene. The next day, May 11, 2022, was preparing to compete in the 157-mile gravel low-coast bike race in Texas. She was staying with a friend in Austin, Texas, while preparing for the upcoming race in Hico. She told her friend she was going for an afternoon swim, but she didn't go along. Cyclist Colin Strickland joined her and the two would have dinner together afterwards. Colin would then drop Mo back at her friend's house. That's where the story takes a horrible turn. Colin's girlfriend, 35-year-old Caitlin Marie Armstrong, was apparently jealous of Mo and Colin's relationship. Armstrong had even confronted Mo before and told her to stay away from Colin. After Colin dropped Mo off, Armstrong would allegedly shoot Mo to death inside of her friend's home. Armstrong had been suspicious of Colin cheating on her with Mo for several months. However, Colin told police that he and Mo were only briefly romantically involved in the fall of 2021, but only while he and Armstrong were temporarily broken up. He said after that, Mo and him remained friends and their relationship became completely platonic and professional. Her loved one said, had no reason to believe that she was romantically involved with anyone when she was killed. 6 days after the murder, police issued a homicide warrant for Armstrong. Following Mo's killing, police located 2 handguns in the home Colin shared with Armstrong, which matched the spent shell casing found at the murder scene. Armstrong's car was also seen on surveillance camera near the crime scene prior to the shooting. Somehow, Armstrong was able to obtain a fraudulent passport and would use this to flee the country. She would fly from Texas to New York and then fly from the New York International Airport to Costa Rica. She was on the run for 43 days until she was found and arrested on June 29, 2022 at a hostel on Santa Teresa Beach in Costa Rica. Investigators discovered that before she fled Austin, Texas, she sold her Jeep Grand Cherokee to a CarMax dealership. Also, while Armstrong was on the run, she cut her hair and dyed it dark brown and wore a bandage on her nose, claiming she had a surfboarding accident. Collins states that he has a lot of regret and torture knowing that this horrible crime was so close to him. As of June 30, 2022, she is being detained in Costa Rica on an immigration violation until she is deported back to Texas to face murder charges and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Michelle Koski was born in 1973 and was said to love animals and enjoyed playing Super Mario Bros. At the age of 17, she was still in high school and living in Seattle, Lake Washington in the 13,300 block of 30th Avenue Northeast, with her 28-year-old boyfriend. She had plans to attend college the next fall and was working at Taco Bell. On August 18, 1990, she called her mother Violet Simonson and agreed to come back home and stay at her and her stepfather's house to take care of the dog while her mother and stepfather went on a trip out of town. Before going to her parents' house, she visited an apartment earlier in the day in the 6200 block of 14th Avenue, Northwest Seattle, and then was given a ride back to her apartment. At some point, though, she was given a ride to an area in Snohomish County where teens were known to hang out, drink, and ride motorcycles. While there, things would take a terrible turn and she would end up missing. A week later, on August 25, 1990, a woman walking her dog near Echo Lake Road and Highway 522 stumbled upon a female's lifeless body. The finding was in Snohomish, Washington, not far from where Michelle went missing. It was determined that the body belonged to Michelle, and she had tragically been sexually assaulted and murdered. Investigators said that whoever committed the crime used pieces of concrete from a nearby pile to finish her off. Her live-in boyfriend was initially a person of interest but would ultimately be ruled out as a suspect. Around the time Michelle's body was found, the Green River Killer had been terrorizing the Seattle area for about a decade, and Seattle investigators considered a serial killer to be a possibility. But sadly, with no concrete evidence pointing at anyone, the case would go cold for the next 3 decades. In 2005, a cold case team reopened her case, and over the next 10 years, they would comb through several possible suspects, but they were all ruled out by DNA comparison. In 2012, the detective on the case stated that what likely happened was the person probably intended to have sex with her, but she didn't want to, and when she tried to flee, he ran her down and strangled her. In 2021, Parabon Nanolabs would take the DNA sample, but their process would be extended because they had to deconvolute the DNA sample because it contained the DNA from both the suspect and victim, which makes it a tedious and challenging process. Then, genetic genealogist Deb Stone spent about 9 more months building a family tree and entering her findings into public genealogy websites, including Family Tree DNA and GeneMatch. From her home in Oregon, she then found 2 likely suspects, which were 2 brothers, and these names were provided to the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office to finish the investigation to determine which one was the likely killer. State and county crime labs compared the crime scene samples to one of the brothers, revealing they were the same person and the DNA was a match. 32 years after her murder, on June 30, 2022, the sheriff's office announced they had identified the killer as Robert Anthony Brooks. Authorities say Brooks was 23 at the time and had been released from prison 4 months before the murder and was living with a relative only a few blocks from Michelle. Authorities did not say for what he was previously convicted of, but it was reportedly a juvenile conviction. During his life, he was never on detectives' radar in her case, and it's unclear how and when she crossed paths with Brooks. But this waste of space wouldn't face justice for Michelle's senseless murder because he died of natural causes at the age of 48 in King County, Washington in 2016. Michelle's mother told TV news crews she was grateful there would be no trial and said other families waiting for answers should take this case to heart and wait for the technology as it's getting better every day, and pretty soon none of those bad guys will be able to hide. In August 2019, employees of McKnight Tire in Columbia, Missouri found a small backpack hidden inside of a tire along the tree line at the edge of the store's parking lot. Upon checking it, they made a gruesome discovery. In the backpack was the decomposing remains of a full-term female infant, which was mostly bones. Due to the state of decomposition, the initial autopsy was unable to determine the cause of death or how long the child may have been there. The Columbia Police Department investigated many leads over the next few years, but were unable to determine what happened to the infant and who her parents were. In September of 2020, Columbia Police Department partnered with Othram to use advanced DNA testing to develop new leads that might help identify the infant. A DNA Solves crowdfund was established to cover the cost of testing for the case. Othram was able to build a comprehensive genealogical profile for the infant. Meanwhile, on June 14, 2022, a letter that had been found years earlier in a wallet hidden behind a drawer at a local Super 8 hotel was released to authorities. When it was first discovered in 2019, the hotel employee didn't know the significance of the disturbing letter. It was then placed in a drawer in Lost and Found, where it remained until news of the discovery of the remains hit the news. It appeared to have been written by the mother of the infant and was intended for the police department. By calling the police and alerting them to the letter, the hotel employee really helped the case despite holding on to it for years. A genetic genealogist built a family tree based on the DNA and was able to give law enforcement a possible identification of the baby and her parents. On June 28, 2022, the Columbia Police Department announced that the baby had been identified as Simone J. Daniels. She was 4 to 5 months old when she died at the nearby hotel, and her remains had been inside the tire since 2017. Her parents were arrested the same day as the press conference released the baby's identity. The letter left at the hotel was the key to solving the mystery. 30-year-old Stefan Fountain of St. Joseph was charged with first-degree murder and abandonment of a corpse, and 28-year-old Lavisha Daniels of St. Louis was charged with abandonment of a corpse and first-degree endangering the welfare of a child. The letter allegedly written by Daniels states that she had completed her shift at People Ready, where she had been working on construction projects. She claims that after coming home, Fountain fed the baby before going to bed, and when Daniels woke up, she discovered her daughter in an odd posture with a towel around her neck and blood in her mouth. She claimed they both attempted CPR before she panicked and ran away while Fountain placed the baby in a backpack and left it at McKnight Tire. According to records, state identity cards were also discovered within the wallet that was left at the hotel. As a last note, Simone wasn't their only child. They actually have several other children together. On December 8, 1993, Valerie Brock found the lifeless body of a baby boy in her backyard in a rural area of Hugo, Oklahoma, and called authorities. The medical examiner would determine that the baby was born alive and then murdered. Now a homicide case, Choctaw County Sheriff's Office brought in OSBI agents to help. Agents conducted numerous interviews in the aftermath of the baby's death, including interviewing 25-year-old Myonia Michelle Allen, who was working for Brock and dating Brock's son. Despite the investigation, no suspects in the homicide were identified. The case went cold, but investigators retained samples of the boy's DNA for future use, and he became known as Baby Boy Hugo. Baby Boy Hugo's case captured the hearts of many in rural Oklahoma, with locals raising money to give him a proper burial. He was buried in January 1994 in Babyland, a section of Mount Olivet Cemetery reserved for infants who'd passed away. Fast forward to October 2020 when an OSBI agent teamed up with the Cold Case Unit and criminologist at the OSBI Forensic Science Center. They submitted DNA evidence to Parbon Nanolabs for testing, and by April 2021, they had results. Upon reviewing the results, the OSBI team pursued their leads right back to Myonia Michelle Allen. On June 15, 2022, an OSBI agent met with Allen at the Durant Police Department, and she agreed to submit DNA samples to determine if she was Baby Doe's biological mother. However, they wouldn't need the DNA results because about 20 minutes into the interview, she admitted the baby was hers and admitted to killing him after he was born, and burying him in the backyard. At the time of Baby Doe's death, Allen worked at a daycare center and Valerie Brock was her boss, the woman that discovered the baby in her backyard and mother of Allen's boyfriend at the time. She allegedly said that she did not tell anyone about her pregnancy, the delivery, or the baby's alleged murder. The court document states that on December 7, 1993, Allen said she had spent the night at Brock's home along with her boyfriend, his son, and her daughter. During the early morning hours of December 8th, she had a physical altercation which caused her to go into labor unexpectedly at Brock's home and gave birth in a barn on the property. She said she carried the newborn to the house after his birth and laid him on a couch inside. She retrieved a weapon from the house and carried him behind the well house. Later that morning, Brock noticed what she thought was a doll in her backyard, but when she walked outside to retrieve the toy, she realized it was a newborn baby. Investigators had originally learned that Allen had spent the night at Brock's home, so they interviewed her on December 17th, 9 days after the homicide. She told detectives she had never seen a pregnant woman at the house. She initially claimed the baby had been stillborn, but a few days later in a follow-up interview, Allen was shown the baby's autopsy report, proving that this was not true. At that point, Allen allegedly confessed to ending his life with a knife. She said she had intended to have Baby Doe at the hospital and put it up for adoption after his birth. Allen was booked into the Choctaw County Detention Center and is being held without bond. And Baby Doe can now be properly laid to rest, and his killer will now be held accountable. In April of 1998, a driver noticed something on the side of Utah Highway 276 near Maiden Water Spring, Utah, that didn't belong, and stopped to investigate. That's when a deceased female's body was discovered inside a sleeping bag. The female had been shot to death, bound with rope and duct tape, and wrapped in a children's rug and put inside a sleeping bag. The victim was also found to be missing the tips of their fingers and thumbs and was believed to be of Hispanic or Native American descent. Unable to determine her identity, despite exhaustive efforts by authorities, she became known as Maiden Water Victim. At first, It was thought she may have been a victim of serial killer Scott Lee Kimball of Boulder, Colorado, who was responsible for at least 4 murders in rural Colorado and Utah between 2003 to 2004 and is thought to have killed more than 21 people. He is currently serving a 70-year prison sentence and at some point was ruled out as her killer. Not only would her identity go unsolved for the next 20 years, but the identity of her killer would go unsolved for the next 24 years. In 2018, when authorities in Utah released a post-mortem photo of the Jane Doe, an amateur internet sleuther in California suggested that the woman looked strikingly similar to Lena Ozagur Geddes, a missing woman from Youngstown, Ohio. The photos were compared and the similarities were uncanny, even down to the mole on her ear. This hunch prompted authorities to put out new information, and then a sister of Lena's traveled from Mexico to Utah to provide her DNA. This DNA was able to help positively identify the Jane Doe as Lena Reyes Geddes. Lena was 37 when she was killed, and her body was discovered 12 days after her death. Her family took her body home in 2019 to lay her to rest. After her identity was discovered, detectives then tried to determine who her killer was. Focusing on the rope that had been found wrapped around her body, a crime scene specialist in Utah with special tools tested it for evidence. One of those tools was an MVAC, described as a wet-dry type device that is used on especially tough surfaces like rope to extract DNA. The MVAC found 117 enneagrams of DNA on the rope, and a DNA profile can be found from just 1 enneagram of DNA. The result consisted of 2 DNA profiles. At this point, for years after Lena's identity was revealed, swabs were collected by 2 willing family members of her cremated late husband, Edward Geddes. Geddes had initially been a suspect in her murder when he declined to report her missing for 6 months. However, Geddes was found in 2001 in Nevada of an apparent suicide using a gun. A search warrant was required, however, to retrieve DNA from Geddes' son. When the DNA samples came back, it came back to 1 DNA profile, Edward Geddes. But a problem was encountered when the other DNA profile was entered into Cody's. It came back to a 2011 murder in Montana, but the DNA wasn't from a killer. It was actually from the not expert that was used in both cases. The expert then submitted his own DNA which matched the second sample taken from the rope, leaving only Edward Gage's DNA profile, and in June 2022, it was announced that he was indeed her killer. Lena was a native of a small Mexican town and was an accomplished ballet dancer with a degree in international business. She unfortunately met Gages in New Mexico in 1996, and the couple married months later and moved to Toledo, Ohio. The couple owned a business where they lived in Youngstown, Ohio, and he would take her life just 2 years later. Her family notified the police when they discovered she was missing after she was supposed to take a trip to Dallas and Laredo, Texas to visit, but never arrived. Her husband only reported her missing 6 months after she was last seen, and when interviewed by police, he claimed he dropped her off at the Pittsburgh airport on April 8, 1998, and kissed her just before she walked into the airport. He described a sleeping bag she was going to give a loved one as a gift that he tightly rolled up with rope just before she left on her trip. I have an update to a story I featured a while back. On December 18, 1996, a groundskeeper discovered an unknown woman's deceased body in a cemetery who would become known as the Christmas Tree Lady. She became known as the Christmas Tree Lady because a small 8-inch Christmas tree was found next to her body. She had 2 envelopes in her pocket. One contained a suicide note requesting that an autopsy not be performed, and one contained 2 $50 bills to cover cremation, and the coroner, and both were signed Jane Doe. It was estimated that she was between 50 and 70 years old. After taking steps to hide her identity, she took her own life at the Pleasant Valley Memorial Park in Annandale, Virginia, 25 years ago. It was initially speculated that since she was found in the baby section of the cemetery that she was possibly grieving the loss of a child buried nearby. An autopsy showed that she had downed a bunch of alcohol and Valium and placed a bag on her head, which slowly suffocated her as she was likely unconscious. In 2000, a colored sketch of the woman was produced in hopes that it might be recognized by friends or family, but the sketch did not produce any leads that led to her identity. Recently, Othram performed advanced DNA testing funded by DNA Solve's crowdfund and a substantial donation by an anonymous donor. From there, genetic genealogist Carla Davis discovered a family member of the Jane Doe and a public genealogy website and was able to build a family tree. This person's name was provided to detectives and the relative provided a DNA sample to confirm the match. Turns out the Christmas tree lady was actually Joyce Marilyn Meyer Summers. Joyce was originally from Davenport, Iowa, and was the oldest of 5 siblings. She died at the age of 69, and it's believed that she likely moved to Virginia after the mid-80s. Although she had a scar on her abdomen that resembled a C-section scar, her family doesn't believe that she ever gave birth. Although never reported missing, her family did search for her and even hired a private investigator to help locate her without any success. The few remaining immediate family members, including her sister Annette, are happy to finally have some answers. It's still a sad story, but at least the Christmas tree lady now has her name back. On the afternoon of November 4, 1999, authorities responded to reports of an infant found wrapped in a towel floating near some boathouses on the Mississippi River in Lake Pepin. A boater who hadn't realized what was in the towel said the baby girl fell out when he plucked the bundle from the water. The child still had its umbilical cord attached, and a post-mortem examination wouldn't find any obvious sustained injuries. So while the coroner was unable to establish a cause of death, they did rule the manner of death a homicide. 4 years later, on December 7, 2003, some teenagers stumbled upon another infant that also had its umbilical cord attached. It was a full-term baby boy on the shoreline of Methodist Campus Beach in Frontenac, Minnesota, in the lower boat harbor of the Mississippi River. This baby was found about 20 miles away from where baby Jane Doe was found in the water 4 years earlier. A post-mortem examination revealed the boy was most likely born alive, but a cause of death could not be determined. Just like baby Jane Doe, the manner of death was ruled a homicide. In the same county, on March 26, 2007, a female infant was discovered by Treasure Island Resort and Casino employees. The infant was either indigenous, American, or Hispanic, and it's unclear if it was dead or alive when put in the water, but authorities stated this infant was likely not related to the other 2 infants. These cases became known as babies in the water, and investigators tried for years to solve the cases. They even made an appeal to the community in 2020 for financial donations in an effort to raise $10,000 to fund the cost of DNA comparisons. One couple that contributed to this funding was Jean and Don Matson, who also led their funerals and paid for their burials along with 2 others. In 2021, the Minnesota Crime Lab was able to determine and identify the biological father of the infant found in 1999. In 2022, they were able to identify the mother of the babies born in 1999 and 2003. With the collaboration of rapid DNA, genetic genealogy, and skilled investigators, the mother was identified as Jennifer Lynn Matter of Red Wing, Minnesota. Investigators questioned the 50-year-old woman on April 25, 2022, and she initially denied ever being pregnant in 1999 and 2003. When she refused to volunteer her DNA, authorities issued a warrant for a sample on May 1, 2022. They later returned to her home and asked about her life back in 1999 when Matter claimed she was in a bad mental state and an alcoholic who was in and out of jail and had experienced chaotic life circumstances for a very long time. She then reportedly said that she never even knew she was pregnant, and one day she began bleeding on her way to drop her children ages 2 and 5 off at school and daycare. She went home, gave birth in the bathroom, and then claimed that the baby was born blue and not breathing, so she freaked out. Authorities allege that due to Matter's alcoholism, she couldn't remember if one day had passed before she left in the middle of the night to put the infant in the water before walking away. Matter initially claimed she couldn't recall the 2003 birth of her son, but then spontaneously stated the location where the baby was found. She explained she was almost positive that she began going into labor on a public beach while it was dark and cold outside. She said she never looked to see if the newborn was a boy or girl, but she remembered leaving the baby on the beach before driving away. Matter later admitted that this baby was breathing fine and it may have been crying, but she couldn't remember. Matter was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, one with intent and one without intent. The first infant had been discarded before the Safe Haven Act was put into law in the year 2000, but the second baby was discarded after the act was enabled. The Safe Haven Act allows mothers or a person appointed by the mother to anonymously relinquish their unharmed newborn within 7 days of birth to certain locations. Matter's next court hearing is scheduled for July 20th, 2022. With 2 of the 3 newborns now identified, investigators hope to solve the case of the baby Jane Doe discovered in 2007. In 1968, Lucille Hultgren moved from Ohio with her family to the small, quiet city of Galt, California. In 1988, at the age of 79, Lucille was a widower living alone at 504 Poplar Street in Galt. She was known as the super sweet lady who offered lemonade and cookies to the children in the neighborhood. Her husband, Frank, had died the year prior, and she had lived alone in a one-bedroom home since the fall of 1985 when Frank entered a convalescent home. The couple had 2 adult children, Frank and Henry, and several grandchildren. She regularly attended church, so when she didn't show one Sunday, her friends became very concerned. So on May 23, 1988, 2 of her church friends went by Lucille's house and found the door ajar and entered the home. They were horrified by what they found in her bedroom. Lucille had been tragically sexually assaulted and murdered. The coroner determined that Lucille had died a few days before her body was found. Thankfully, DNA found under her fingernails was able to be collected and preserved. Then 4 years later, in 1992, a transient and registered sex offender by the name of Terry Leroy Bramble was convicted for sexual assault in San Joaquin County. The DNA from the case was collected and preserved. Then in May of 2022, 34 years later, and with the advances in technology, 2 and 2 were put together, and it was found that the DNA from the 1992 sexual assault matched the DNA from the 1988 murder. However, Bramble would not face justice because in 2011, he died at the age of 55 of natural causes under the Highway 99 bridge in Galt where he lived. Lucille's one surviving son, Frank, stated that he wished he could see the killer face justice, and he wished his brother was still alive to see this case solved. Ricky Kevin Lubert was born March 4, 1965 to parents Emil and June Lubert. At the age of 42, Ricky lived on Highway H in Texas County, Missouri, about a mile from the town of Tyrone, and was the father of 2 sons that he dearly loved. He was also a member of the Tyrone Volunteer Fire Department. In November of 2007, when Ricky failed to show up for a work project, his neighbor went to check on him and would shockingly find Ricky's deceased body. It was determined that he had been shot to death about 3 days earlier. There were multiple bullet holes in the front window of his mobile home, and authorities believe the suspect shot into the trailer from the highway. During the investigation into the murder, Tommy Wetzel became a person of interest and would remain a person of interest for a long time. But without hard evidence that would hold up at trial, no arrests could be made. During the investigation of Wetzel, he was charged and convicted of a federal weapons violation, but he wasn't charged at the time in connection with the murder itself. In January 2022, the Texas County Sheriff's Office reopened the case with the help of Steve Spangler and Kelly Siegler from the Cold Justice television program. With the extra resources, new interviews, and a fresh look into the original case files and evidence, it would lead to the indictment of 63-year-old Tommy Wetzel, who was charged with first-degree murder. On June 29, 2022, nearly 15 years after the murder, Wetzel was arrested at his home in Liberal, Missouri, and brought to Texas County to be held without bond. It's not publicly known at this time how the 2 men were acquainted and the reason for the murder.